All right, welcome to the August 2022 Libraries Connecting Texas E-Rate webinar. We're glad you're joining us today. You are used to hearing Caroline Wolf present, and while she's with us, she's under the weather. So we will hopefully make her proud and do her job justice. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about where we are with the funding for our team, for our group for 2022. And then we have a guest this month, Charles Thacker, who is our IT director at E-Rate Central, and he's going to walk through the eligible services and kind of go through some information that you'll need in terms of preparing for your Form 470 if you need one for funding year 2023. And then Kyle's going to close us out with next steps. Actually, Kyle, I think it may have been a syncing issue. Give me just a sec. Can you see my screen? All right, so sorry about that. So our summary for where we are for funding year 2022's funding. Congratulations, all of our applications filed for 2022 in the LCT program have been committed. So that's exciting news. Kyle's going to go over the next steps if you just recently received your funding commitment decision letter. Around $981,000 in pre-discount funding has been committed for our libraries. So that's pretty awesome. And that's all the work that you guys did for the 471 last spring. And around 749,000 in discounts have been committed for LCT libraries. So congratulations, it's a lot of money coming towards you guys for internet access for this year. So I'm now going to hand it off to Charles Thacker so he can tell you all the good things about funding and eligible services.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to give a little bit of a clarification. I think that the slide may have had incorrect information as far as what I'm going to be sharing. So this is going to be a little bit more about understanding bandwidth, as well as some technology pieces, some common terms, kind of an introduction to some of these topics that you may or may not be familiar with, and then a little bit of a touch on some eligible services, but not a high amount. And I think I may have worn the wrong patterned shirt for this, depending on how everybody else is seeing that, because it's looking a bit psychedelic to me. So I'm actually going to enjoy that for a bit. So as mentioned, my name is Charles Thacker. I'm the Director of Technology for E-Rate Central, and I come from a public education background, initially as a teacher, and then in technology, moving up through the ranks to the Executive Director of Technology level for Farmington Municipal Schools in New Mexico. So I know we're dealing with Texas. Don't hate me for that part of being in New Mexico. Today, what I'd like to do is go through a little bit about bandwidth and understanding bandwidth. And let me make sure we're on our right slide. And today I'd like to go over a little bit of common terms. Try not to delve into that too far, or take up too much time on that, talk a little bit about bandwidth, and then offer up an opportunity for anyone to ask questions, have comments, criticisms, whatever, regarding what I've covered today. So going into a little bit of the techie jargon, things that you may see and run across, I like to start really at the base level, just because I think it's very interesting. And the base level of data is a great starting point for us, but I like the fact that all of the technology that we're using, everything we're doing, including this Zoom presentation and this technology that we're leveraging, is all based on a 0 or a 1, whether something is on or off. And as we start talking about bandwidth, This is all important just because this is what's passing over all of your networks, these ones and zeros, which collectively put together start to build up more and more data. 8 of those bits makes a byte. We collect a bunch of those bytes, and we don't hear this term very much, but kilobit and kilobyte. Our drives used to be measured in that, but now it's too small, and we're into megabit, megabyte, as well as tera, peta, etc. And what I want to point out, I think, on this as it relates to bandwidth is the difference that you might see in the megabit, megabyte, that we have a small b and we have a big B. And there is a difference between those two. I bring that up because when you're looking at bandwidth services, you may see a big or a little b on there, and it may or may not be an accurate representation of what you're getting. The small b in that, specifically in this megabit per second, refers to bits, not bytes. Megabyte is normally going to be used when you're dealing with a storage environment. So the size of a file, not necessarily speed. And remember, you have a bit, which is 1/8 of a byte. It takes 8 bits to make up a byte, which means that a byte is 8 times of 1 bit. This can get confusing when you start looking at maybe your invoicing, or you start talking with service providers and they're offering up certain services. A 100 megabit internet connection is in fact a 12.5 megabyte internet connection. And this can cause some confusion for some people when they see that their data transfers may not be happening at the speed that they're expecting, such as a 100 megabit connection will transfer a 100 megabyte file in 8 seconds, not 1 second. So as you're looking at your file transfers or speeds of downloads, bear in mind that that small b and big B do make a difference, and your internet service provider is normally going to be giving you megabits per second. Another term that you're going to run across, and this will relate a little bit to some IP addressing schemes that you may have for your organization or for your library, whether you're securing an outside IP address or not. But an IP stands for Internet Protocol. It is a unique to that particular network address, which is assigned to all devices that communicate on that address, or I'm sorry, on that network. This is comprised, again, going back to the bit concept, it's comprised of ones and zeros on the back end. 32 of those ones and zeros all run together, make up an IP version 4 address. Those are called octets, each of those 8 chunks of bits, and they are made readable to us in decimal. So in this example, all that string of ones and zeros represents 192.168.52.250. You might see these IP addresses very commonly inside your network. IP version 6 is a new protocol that's been put out. It has been used, although many of you are not seeing it leveraged directly and you're not managing it, but most of your devices are now leveraging a version 6 address in addition to that version 4. And these IP addresses can be both public and private. So they can be public on the internet, or they can be private on your intranet inside of your network. And there's an important distinction there. When we talk about inside and outside IP addresses, there are a range of addresses that can be used inside your network, and they can be used by anyone in the world over and over and over again because it's inside their network. And your network and their network never communicate with each other directly, so it's okay to have these same addresses. And these are 3 ranges that you might see on your inside network. So you may see devices on your network that have a 10 dot something address, 172.16, all the way up to 172.31 in that range. And then also the 192.168 is also a very common address range. On the outside, though, you don't have those addresses. In fact, you cannot publish those addresses out on the internet. There are systems and devices that will prevent them from making it outside. Your inside address gets translated to an outside address. For an example, Google's DNS server is 8.8.8.8. Apple has a whole big range. They have several ranges, but this is one of theirs. And this is a range for Verizon, again, as an example. These addresses on the outside of your network would be used by your inside devices, but they'll get translated in the process. And when you secure services through an internet service provider, they will oftentimes give you an IP address on the outside for you to use. They might give it to you temporarily, much like your home network, where you'll get it for X amount of time. You may end up with the same IP address day after day, week after week, month after month, but it might change also. If you have services that you need to make sure the public can get to regularly all the time, you can't have that outside address changing like that. So you probably are also going to secure from your ISP a dedicated address or multiple addresses that would be associated with your network and your environment, so that visitors from the outside world can come into your system, get to your web server, your catalog server, perhaps something like that. If you change ISPs, that address could theoretically change, in which case you need to either work with that ISP to make a migration and possibly work with a network solutions provider internally to change your internal networking scheme so that you have translations that are working correctly for those outside addresses. Or perhaps you have purchased your own IP addresses. This isn't as common with smaller organizations. It's normally larger groups that are doing this, but you might be able to secure your own IP address and keep it no matter who your internet service provider is. The point here that I wanted to be able to share, though, is that you will have addresses on the inside of your network, you will have addresses on the outside of your network, and if you change your ISP, considering what to do about those outside IP addresses is very important. All of these things are used, all of these IP addresses are used by the multiple devices that we have on our networks, which include a computer, printer, phone, camera, doorbells now, garage door openers, this entire Internet of Things, all of the things that can connect to your network, your refrigerator, your coffee maker, all kinds of things are able to be connected, accessed either internally on your network or remotely if you're anywhere that you have an internet connection, which is quite convenient. But also opens up the door to a lot of traffic, as well as potential infiltration from malicious actors. So we need to make sure that we're careful on our network as well. But I just wanted to point out that each of these devices is going to have a connection to your network, and they're all going to have an IP address internally. And this is going to tie in with our bandwidth discussion. I did want to take just a moment and kind of pause. I don't know if we have someone else who might be monitoring a chat if we have any, but I don't see any chat questions. I did want to pause though and let people ask any at this point in time. We'll give just a little bit of a wait moment. I know I kind of went fairly quickly through that. I want to make sure I have time to go over some of the bandwidth items. Go ahead.
Charles, we
and
do have a Q&A enabled. Perfect. So if we see one, we'll let you know.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Understanding bandwidth needs, much like time and money, you rarely have enough. We can always use more. So what I would like to do is just give you a little bit of an example of how bandwidth should be calculated, measured, and potentially even just thought of in general, so you understand it for your own network. A network is, in essence, a couple devices talking to each other. So in this case, we'll take a computer and a switch, and we'll connect those two. And they're going to connect at a certain speed. Now, you don't have to worry about what those numbers actually represent. Megabits per second is what they're going to represent, but you can think of it like miles per hour, perhaps on a car. The higher the number, the faster the speed. In this case, let's just call it 1,000 connection between the computer and that switch. We're also going to connect out to the internet because most of what we're going to be doing is most likely outside of our network and on the internet. And we have other devices on our network, a wireless access point perhaps. So a computer could connect to a wireless access point at a variety of speeds. In this case, we'll just call it 54. And that network connection between the WAP, the wireless access point, and the switch will also have a speed associated with it. And if we're going to do these calculations of how fast are we actually traveling, how much data can we actually pull down, and how much do I need based on my devices, we want to think about a water pipe, something that it's a very simple analogy, something that is passing water through. And it has different sizes based on those numbers. So we may have a section of the pipe that has 54 as a size, and it goes to a larger pipe that is 100, maybe even goes to a really big pipe of 1,000, possibly drops back down to 100. And at the end of all of that, where are we with our speed? And if we take this water pipe analogy, we have to take the smallest diameter and use that as our fastest speed. So 54 out of this entire chain is in fact the fastest that we would be able to communicate out on the internet. If we broaden this out to a larger network environment, we put in place a switch, we connect to the internet, and we'll say we have 100 connection to the internet in this regard. And then we have a wireless access point connected to our switch, a nice 1,000 connection there. We need to bring in clients who's going to be using our network. Every single client that you add onto your network will increase your bandwidth needs. They're going to take up bandwidth that you have available. Now, base 10 is much easier than base 5, so we'll make a nice round 10 on here. And all of these machines are connecting to this network, which has 1,000 connections. Let's say they're all wireless. They each can operate at 100. They're connecting to the WAP at 100. Each of them are. And we have 1,000 connection from the WAP to the switch. The simple math says, great, everybody gets to have the speed of 100 across the board. They're all operating at their maximum speed capability on that wireless network. The problem in this case, and again, thinking of our water pipe, is we now have an internet connection that is only 100. That also needs to be divided by how many devices are using it. That means that every single client is in fact operating at just 10. This is the division that you need to work on. This is what you need to calculate when you're looking at what bandwidth do I need for my environment and for my organization. How many clients do I have? What is my smallest pipe out to the internet? So right now, that internet connection is the choke point. That's the bottleneck for this particular network. Touching a little bit on what was originally introduced in the slide as far as eligibility, you can look at your eligibility in these general categories. When I say categories, I do mean both category 1 and 2, as well as types of equipment. So on the far left, we have all of our devices. And historically within the E-rate program, those have been ineligible for any E-rate funding. The ECF program has kind of changed that and modified that. So your E-rate specialists that are on the call now will be the ones who are best able to address that with you, but there are some funding opportunities for that now. Within the category 2 space, you're generally dealing with your internal connections, everything that is required in order for those devices to be able to communicate inside on your network. And as soon as you leave your network, then you're dealing with category 1, and that would traditionally be your internet service provider connections. Different types of connections that you might be able to find for your internet service provider. We're going to talk a little bit about factors that you should consider. If you don't consider these, you're not going to be making a wise choice. So availability, because if you can't get it, doesn't matter how good it is. Affordability, if you can't afford it, it still doesn't matter how good it is. Reliability, if it's not reliable, it's probably not worth what you're spending on it. And is the speed appropriate for what you need? If you have poor performance, you're going to have a lot of people questioning why you're paying for that service. The major technologies that are going to be available to you now are fiber, which has a high speed and reliability. It's the most expensive, and it's generally the least available depending on your location, especially if you're in a rural environment, unless a lot of infrastructure has been built out in your area. Cable, which has a higher availability, pretty good speed, and a competitive cost. It's pretty widespread. DSL, or a digital subscriber line that comes from a telco or telephone company, pretty widely available, lower speeds, and also lower cost to go along with that. Wireless, which is growing in availability, and this is a direct wireless connection from your network to an internet service provider. It's not the internal wireless that would run your devices. And then satellite, which has been growing. It's widely available because the fact that you just simply have to have a view of the sky, and depending on the type of technology, such as some Starlink options that are coming up, maybe just having view to a local aggregation point, which has the view to the sky with a larger antenna. It is going to have lower speeds than some of these other technologies, and it does still have a pretty high cost. The fiber environment, a little more detail on it, has some of those highest speeds available, and importantly, they can be symmetrical, meaning that your download can be the same as your upload. That's not always the case. That will depend on your internet service provider, but you might find that you can get a fiber connection where your download speeds and upload speeds are the same. And they're often dedicated to you, so you're not sharing that with anybody. Has a high reliability, very well future-proofed, 30-year lifespan without much of a problem if it's done properly. It's not readily available outside of major metropolitan areas, though, again, unless someone has set up a lot of infrastructure in your area. And it has a high total cost, but it's often one of the lower costs per megabit. So if you're calculating it that way, it can be very cost effective. Cable, again, has some high speeds available, several hundred megs, sometimes up to a gig. It's asymmetrical in general, so it is going to be a different speed download than you would upload. Generally, the upload is going to be slower. And you might have a little bit of congestion if there's high usage in your area because it is a shared topology. You are going to be sharing that with a lot of other users. Generally has good reliability. It's readily available in most populated areas. It has reasonable costs. So it's not a bad thing to consider, especially for some smaller networks. DSL is going to be low to medium speeds, a few hundred megs capped, and you're going to have to be pretty close to their point of presence for that to work. It's also asymmetrical, different download and upload speeds. The bandwidth is dedicated to you until you get into the main network. Generally good reliability, depending on your area and your telephone providers that are in the area. Generally available and pretty reasonable cost. It's kind of a low option though in general, I think. Wireless, because it's growing, needs to be on this list as well. Low to medium speeds, again, asymmetrical normally, depending on your provider. And sometimes they will put data caps in place. So if you go over a certain amount of data within a billing period, then you might get charged extra, or they may slow your speed down a bit. And you can also experience some latency, meaning that the traffic isn't traveling in the exact same order that it should all the time, and it has to reshuffle, and you're going to see a little bit of latency in the process of loading things and downloading things. This is, and I bring that up predominantly if you're a gamer, you're going to notice that, but I don't think that anybody here is really trying to build their network out for gaming, although patrons may be showing up for that purpose. Has decent reliability, although some obstacles and weather can adversely affect that performance. It's growing in availability, and it's a medium to high cost, and it can be pretty high per meg. Satellite, low to medium speeds right now. It's growing, it's getting better, but it is still capping out at kind of the low to medium end. Again, it's going to be asymmetrical, definitely higher latency in your traffic, in part because it is going all the way to space and back. And so there's a lot of distance involved there, and that is going to introduce some latency in that communication. Pretty decent reliability though. Again, obstacles and weather can adversely affect those connections. It's available in almost all areas because of the fact that it's looking to the sky. It does have high cost, and especially at a per meg calculation level. If I were to rank these, I would say if you can afford it and it's available, you can go in this order. Fiber, especially dedicated or fiber shared, is going to be one of your better options if you can get to that. Cable is going to be another option. And I should back up just a little bit. That fiber could be something that is already pre-built. It doesn't have to be something built specifically to go to you, but an ISP may have a really strong fiber backbone very nearby, and they can drop fiber into your location, and you can gain access to that. Cable, I think, would be in your next level. And then after that, these other services based on availability as well as cost and what you're looking for your environment. As I mentioned, the new satellite technologies are changing the affordability, availability, and reliability of that service. So it's something to certainly to keep an eye on. So I'm a big fan of analogies. So it's time for an analogy in my presentation. And the one I use for this is sports cars on dirt roads. If you have high-speed devices and you have a slow network, then you have fast cars on bad roads, and nobody enjoys driving on those. If you have lost confidence by your staff, by your patrons, by your guests, by all of your users, then they're not going to be as supportive of your organization, of your funding towards your network, just because they see it as something that isn't working well. And you want to make sure you have patrons coming back again and again, and that they feel that it's a good space for them to be at for network connectivity. So building that infrastructure, building out the highway, making it so that these fast cars can in fact travel the way they should, is going to help your reputation, and it's going to help make sure that you bring customers, patrons, guests back into your environment. It's also going to help your staff do their jobs better. And we do like to keep our staff happy as well. So how much speed do you actually need? And unfortunately, the answer is it depends, but it's probably more than you have. I think we all struggle to have enough bandwidth in our environments, and you can use some pretty basic calculations for this as well. There's some standards out there you can look up. Streaming video, 3 to 25 megabits per second. Video conferencing, 1 to 6, like the Zoom that we're doing now in the webinar. Email and browsing is a lot less. Online learning goes up a bit because you're doing a lot of dynamic content and not everybody's using the same thing at the same time. And then you need to consider all of your users on your network. That's your staff, your patrons, guests, anybody that's going to be using your network, and how many at one time would be there. Do you have some events that are happening? Bear in mind that most of the people using networks have multiple devices. So maybe they're bringing their phone as well as using one of your computers, or they're bringing a computer and a phone and they're both on the network. You have variety of internet access based on the list on the left. You have regular business needs, and then you have special events. So make sure that you're accommodating for that. You don't want to have a special event happen and everything craters and nobody can do what they need to because we just overloaded the network. And do you have hosted services on your network? Do people need to be coming in to your network from the outside world? Do you need to be using your internet connection for voice over IP connections for your phone system? Do you have your card catalog system hosted on your internal network and people need to access it? Bear those things in mind as another piece of bandwidth that you need to calculate for. And after you've done all of this, add a little bit more. It's never going to hurt if you can bump it up just a little bit with your ISP. So that's my fairly quick and rapid rundown of bandwidth and some basic terminology. And I will actually have the ability to answer questions, comments, concerns either now, or I will go ahead and stick around as well to the end of the webinar and see if anything else shows up. So if there's anything now, we can do that. But if not, the E-Rate Central team can take it over and do some closing notes as well.
Charles, I always love your presentations. They help make things make sense. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right, Kyle, I think Kyle has a couple of slides to talk about with a few reminders, and then we'll let you guys go.
Sure. Happy to continue with that. Thank you again, Charles, for the very informative presentation there. Again, if you have any questions, type them in as we're talking about these last few reminders. And Charles, it does look like we have some questions. Do you want to handle those now or after our reminders, Charles?
Let's let a few of them come in. So go ahead and go through your reminders, and then we'll see what we circle back.
Sounds great. So we are looking forward to September coming up next week. Some action items to keep in mind and address sooner than later are the funding year 2021 bearers. The deadline to file is going to be October 28th, 2022. So be sure to, if you have not filed bearers before, get bearer portal access in addition to file your Form 498. If you have any questions on how to do either of those, please reach out to us. We can also help provide you with a bearer workbook in which you can enter all the information which will be needed on the bearer and which you can then save for later as part of your records. The funding year 2022 Form 486 also needs to be filed if you have not filed that already. The Form 486 deadline is 120 days after the release of the funding commitment decision letter, the FCDEL, or 120 days after the service start date, whichever is later between those two. Now, the service start date is likely going to be July 1st, 2022 for funding year 2022 services, unless your connection is going to start later than that. If your services have started and the library is Children's Internet Protection Act compliant, you should go ahead and file that Form 486 as soon as you have your FCDL. And then finally, looking forward to the funding year 2023, consider the information that Charles has presented about the internet and bandwidth and the different sorts of connections, and consider what your library may file for in terms of a upgrade in bandwidth or whatever the case may be, especially if your current internet contract is ending prior to June 30th of 2024, because you'll need something to cover that funding year there. That then brings us, I think, to our last couple of reminders. Just as a reminder, you can always contact us by email at lct@erates.com or at our LCT hotline, which is 516-801-7820. And again, our next call is going to be the fourth Thursday of September. So that is September 22nd at the same time, 2 p.m. Central Time. And it looks like we do have a couple of questions for Charles. Whenever you're ready, Charles.
Let's see if we have, looks like in the question and answer, it is separate. So what I've got so far in the chat, at least, is how do you figure out what your smallest speed spot is? So where might that bottleneck be? The general process you're going to want to do is, number one, if you don't have it, create or get a network map. So identify what pieces of equipment you have and what speed they connect at. You will generally have a connection coming from your ISP, which would go to a router. You might have a couple of other pieces of equipment there, a firewall, which might be built into the router or not, but you're going to have equipment that the ISP connects to, and then you're going to be connecting that equipment to your internal network, which would be a switch, most likely, and then that is going to connect out to either wireless access points, WAPs, or directly to devices, a computer, a printer, et cetera. And you want to map those out and then identify on each of those connections, what is the speed there? So what speed is your internet service provider giving you? What speed can your modem or your router connect to your network equipment? What speed is your network equipment connecting to your devices? You don't have a lot of control over some of the endpoint devices. If there are people bringing in equipment to your network and they're connecting, you don't have a lot of control over that. And one thing you might want to identify is, where are you hearing of problems? If you're hearing of problems from guests and patrons, and it's normally on their own device, you're going to want to identify what devices are they using, and are they generally fairly old or are they new, and what are they connecting to on your network? That's their point of entry, because that might actually be the problem if the rest of your network is not experiencing issues. Maybe your patron machines that are connected to your network that you own, your staff machines, printers you don't seem to be having a problem with. If you are experiencing more problems than that inside your network, take a look at those numbers. What's a computer connecting to your switch at? What is your switch capable of doing? What's your switch connecting to your modem or your router at? And then what's your ISP? The smallest number among that entire chain is going to be where your bottleneck is. So if you have 100 meg connection from your modem to your switch, and you have 100 meg connections out to all of your devices, but you have a 10 meg or even 100 meg connection to the ISP, that's probably where your choke point is going out to the ISP. And you want to try to push that choke point as far away from your own network as possible, and then have the ISPs bumped up to handle it. In the example I just gave, where you have 100 connection everywhere, bear in mind, I have 10 laptops all connected at 100. What I would really like to see, if those machines are going to handle their full-on speed and run the way I want out of my internet connection, I need 10 times 100 out at my internet connection. So that's where you do the math of how many people are using my network, what speeds are they probably going to be operating at, and what are they going to be doing as far as services. When we looked at that services page, as far as how much speed is required for each type of protocol or what kind of activity they're doing, you can get a rough guess of, maybe I need to give everybody 15 megs You know, that should give them email browsing, a little bit of video transfer. They can do web browsing without a problem. And if I calculate that everybody has 15 megabits per second, and then I multiply that by how many do I envision are going to be on my network at one time, make sure that no leg in your network diagram has a number that is less than that. However many users times 15, I should have that much available all the way through my network as much as possible. My guess is for many of you, the choke point is still going to be your internet service provider, unless they're giving you several hundred megs or even a gig or more of connectivity. But it really does depend on the size of your environment, who you're trying to serve.
Thanks, Charles. I hope that answers your question, Marisol. If you have any other questions, now's a great time to ask them for anyone who does have questions. You can also reach out to us after the call, and we can talk about any additional questions you have.
And I'm happy to be on a lot of those calls if I can help out.
You got the expert, so. All right, so I think that may do it, but thank you again, Charles, for joining us and for that excellent presentation. My apologies for the technical difficulties with the slides. Again, if you have any questions, please reach out to us at lct@eratecentral.com or our hotline at 516-801-7820. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining today.
Thank you. Have a great rest of the week.
Thanks all.